in Albany. He does penetration testing and is one of ATech Group's trusted partners for that. We are firm believers in not checking our own work, so we have Tyler to do that for us. And he's going to go over the 5 hacker headache inducers that he would run into as a hacker, and hopefully it'll help all of us be a bit more secure going forward. Tyler, take it away whenever you are ready.
Great, thanks, Nicole. And let me just get this shared here. All right, so let's get this party started. So first, let me introduce myself and my background. So I am Tyler Wrightson. I am the founder of Leet Cybersecurity. Leet is based out of Albany, New York. We're about a dozen people at this point, and we only do one thing. All we do is break security and find weaknesses. All we do is hack organizations. So we don't sell hardware or software. We don't fix any of the issues we find. That's all we do. Me personally, I've written 2 books, one on wireless network security and one on hacking and offensive security. I've been in the field professionally for about 16 or 17 years now, but longer as a hobbyist. More important than I think than any of my professional background is the fact that I eat, sleep, and breathe security. It is what I love. It is my passion. Frankly, calling it a passion might be a bit of an understatement. It's closer to an obsession, I think. So normally during the talks that I give, I like a lot of interactive conversations and feedback. So unfortunately on a WebEx, that's a little hard to do. So I will say save your questions to the end. I can't see the chat window right now, so if you have any questions that you don't want to forget, feel free to throw them in the chat window, and I will get to those at the end of the talk. So first, comment on who I believe is in attendance and who this talk is really geared towards, and that's my fellow cybersecurity nerds. So the practitioners, the people in charge of securing organizations, and the folks that are responsible for implementing technical controls. So that's not to say that anyone higher or lower on the food chain is not going to find some value in this, but the technical content is definitely geared towards you folks. So why are you here? What is the purpose of this talk, and what will you gain from this? Again, I want to introduce 5 low-cost, from a capital perspective, 5 low-cost technical controls that you can implement that make things harder for hackers. So without further ado, here they are. Don't reuse your credentials, properly segment your network, implement basic security monitoring, limit internet access, and don't use PowerShell. All right, thank you all for joining this WebEx. I'll take questions now. All right, without being able to hear the laughter, I'm just going to assume you guys are laughing. So anyway, let me go over why I believe our perspective is unique. Is again because we are the hackers. That's all we do is break security. And so I think that we provide a unique perspective in the ability to say, hey, these are the things that either trip us up or make it more difficult for us to penetrate organizations, or give you the defenders an opportunity to stop us and or detect us. So that's why I think we have a very, very unique perspective. So I want to go over a little bit of our philosophy and where these technical controls come from. And if you haven't had a chance to Google Velociraptor, if you're bored and you need 10 minutes to go off on a tangent, I highly recommend that you Google Velociraptor. So anyway, let's go over our philosophy. So first, the real core of the value that I think we bring to our clients can be summarized by a quote from the famous Chinese general Sun Tzu, in which he said, "If you know thyself and know thy enemy, you need not fear the outcome of 100 battles." And so again, what he's saying is that if you understand the hackers' motives and their tactics and what they're actually going to do, then you can obviously properly defend against those things, and thus you need not fear them. and I really think that that holds up well to today. Also part of our philosophy is KISS. Not this KISS, this KISS. Nope, not this KISS, this KISS. So we believe in keeping it simple, and that a lot of the issues come about with unnecessary complexity in networks and controls, and so that at every opportunity we look for the simplest solution, which will make it more practical as well. And so thus we also believe in that, practical solutions, and not trying to boil the ocean or implement things that are too difficult or too complex or unnecessarily complex. We also believe that defense in depth is one of the core tenets of cybersecurity, and it definitely holds up. All of the controls that we're going to go over here are not perfect, and thus you need to implement a defense in depth strategy. And so basically, defense in depth is that, not relying on one specific control, because all controls are inherently imperfect, and you need compensating and backup controls. And so really, if you look at the controls that I've already mentioned that we're going to go into detail more, they're fundamentally pretty basic. And so again, the organizations that we see doing things well are those that kind of embrace the basics. These controls have been around for decades, and so ultimately we're not necessarily saying anything new. Some of these might be new manifestations of those very basic types of controls, but we really believe in that to properly secure yourselves, you should really head back to basics. And so I mentioned earlier that these controls that we're recommending have a very low capital cost. And so because there is no such thing as a free lunch, what do they cost? And so ultimately, the primary cost to these is personal time and expertise. And so luckily, the expertise requirement is relatively low. Again, these are relatively basic controls, but they do cost time to implement. And so there are some pros and cons to that. Obviously, the pro being, you don't have to worry about budget. Some of the approval processes should be easier. But obviously, the con is that you need to invest some time before you actually see your risk lowered based on implementing these controls. Okay, so I want to go off on a quick tangent here, and just make sure that we're utilizing the same language, because a lot of times, even within cybersecurity, some people use some of these terms incorrectly. So I want to make sure that we're using the same terms and speaking about the same things when we talk about technical controls and what we're doing. So from a very high level, the most basic risk calculation comes down to these few components and one more calculation after this, which is basically you identify a vulnerability, and then you understand a threat and how it will actually take advantage of that weakness. And then you determine if that threat were to utilize that method to exploit that vulnerability, what would the impact be? And once you understand that impact, you determine the likelihood of that occurring. So this is where some of the black magic of cybersecurity comes into play, because there are no, we can use simple statistics with things like, hurricanes and floods, how likely you are to experience things, but you can't necessarily use that same math to determine if you're going to experience some type of breach or a specific breach. So, you determine this likelihood, and then once you have that likelihood, you pair that with the impact, and you come up with the risk, right? And so the important thing here that it seems like a lot of my technical nerds tend to get confused is that vulnerability does not equal risk, right? And at least they are not synonymous. So generally speaking, where there's vulnerability, there is risk, although that doesn't necessarily hold up entirely in every situation. But generally speaking, where there's vulnerability, there's risk, but they're not synonymous. And so it's important to understand that different threat, exploit, vulnerability pairs thus have different risks. So even if it's the same exploit method and the same vulnerability, but a different threat with different motives and different likelihoods that they're actually going to target your organization, that is a different risk, all right? And so generally speaking, with the organization that we work with, it seems like generally they understand vulnerabilities and to the for the most part, they understand the impact of what would happen if that vulnerability would be exploited. Now, it seems like there's still a very, very large black box in these organizations understanding threats, how the threats actually manifest themselves, and the methods that those threats use to exploit those vulnerabilities. And so again, that's where we come into play. And so we find that most organizations tend to, because they don't necessarily have a really great handle on threats and their methods and motives, that they tend to focus on the vulnerabilities and exclusively on the vulnerabilities, which, as you can see, based on the risk equation, that's only a small part of it. And so if you focus on that, you can't accurately gauge where you should be spending your resources of time and money to compensate for this risk. And so there's a big gray area as well, where mostly organizations seem to understand, again, the vulnerability and impact, but what they don't understand is how you can take multiple risks and chain them together. And so, you'll hear offensive security firms like ours talk about that frequently, which is, they don't understand the aggregate risk of chaining all of these seemingly innocuous vulnerabilities and risks together, and what an actual attacker would do. So we're going to actually come back to this in a minute with a really good example from a test that we performed. And so again, there seems to be a lot of misunderstanding, even with some very, very large firms like the Wrightson report that they release every year, in miscategorizing threats. And so these are some very, very basic examples of different threats. And you can see here that we've kind of organized them by general technical skill, right? So you have like a standard criminal with virtually no technical skills. And so those are very, very common, right? Think about your own personal lives. If you've ever had anything stolen, me personally, I've had things stolen right out of my car, and I think that that's a very common thing because the barrier to entry for that type of crime is relatively low, right? It's very, very easy for someone to just smash a window and take things that they care about, whereas, the likelihood that your organization is going to experience cybercrime, sure, it's growing, but it's definitely less likely that you'll experience that before at least experiencing criminals and script kiddies. And so when determining the controls that we want to put in place, we see a lot of organizations kind of, implementing technical controls that run the spectrum of the different threats without fully taking care of the risks that are likely to be exploited by these lower tier threats first. So more on that soon. One of the biggest things is the miscategorization of employees as threats. And so I want you all to say this with me. Employees are not threats. Generally speaking, they are vulnerabilities. And so that is not to say that employees cannot be threats, but the thing is, if you look back at this, that would make them a criminal. And sure, you might have staff members or employees that are criminals or script kiddies and have specific motives of trying to do something malicious, but it's very different, the approach that you should take when dealing with the vast majority of your employees, treating them as vulnerabilities and attack surface and not treating them like threats. So this is a picture of Muhammad Ali. He is the greatest boxer of all time. If you disagree with me, then you are wrong. So moving on. So what I'm going to do now is go over a story of ours, an external penetration test that we were on, to highlight some of the controls that we're recommending and how those would have slowed us down, inhibited us, or even made it impossible for us to accomplish what we were trying to do. So an external penetration test, this was a purely technical pen test. We couldn't do any social engineering. We couldn't trick users via email or over the phone or anything like that. So it was just against technical assets. So we were connected to the internet. We performed some reconnaissance, identified all of the things we cared about in this target organization. And we identified what they had labeled, or at least explained to us later, was a junk application, an application with meaningless data that they didn't really care about. That was kind of just a legacy system that they had demonstrated to clients, and they said, yeah, there's nothing in that of value. There's nothing we care about. So what they didn't realize was that there was a SQL injection vulnerability in that application, and we were able to dump all the contents of the database. So again, even in conversations, they said, well, that's not a big deal because, again, we don't really care about that. What they failed to account for was the fact that we now had access to usernames and hashed passwords. And so we were actually able to crack, I think, roughly 1/3 of those passwords. Many of those were employees at this organization. And so what we did is that once we had all of those clear text passwords, we said, okay, great, where else might these be used? So we utilized those passwords to log into any system that we identified as relating to that organization, one of them being Gmail. So we had access to all of those employees' email. And more importantly, we actually identified what they called an important application. And so we were actually able to log into that utilizing the same credentials of one of their employees as the junk application. Once we were in this important application, we identified some functionality. Basically, it was command injection. We were able to execute arbitrary commands via scripting languages. And that script was actually run on an internal application. So the interesting thing about this is that that internal application was only accessible from this important application. So we on the internet could not communicate directly with this internal application. So thus we would need access to that important app. So once we had complete control of this internal application, and the way we did that was to have the internal app actually call back to our laptop. So even though our laptop could not initiate a connection to the internal application, it could initiate a connection out to us, and thus we were able to compromise it and communicate with it that way. From there, we just did some quick internal network discovery to identify what we might have access to. And because this was believed to be a trusted and secure application, it had access to everything. We could communicate directly with the Active Directory domain controller. And so then we said, okay, we have all of these other passwords. Let's see if any of these work internally as well. And sure enough, one of the other administrator passwords that we had obtained from the junk application actually gave us domain administrator credentials on the DC. So once we had domain admin credentials, what did we have access to from that point? Everything, right? So we literally had access to every single file that they had ever created, because we also had access to their backup system, everything confidential, sensitive, obviously all of their email. We actually even had access to compromise very easily all of their workstations. So literally we had access to everything that this organization could possibly care about purely from the outside. And so again, this is a very, very good example of organizations misunderstanding what happens when you chain some of these risks together, because even if they had gone through a proper or a seemingly proper risk management process or an assessment of risk, they might have said, okay, what happens if this junk application is taken over? And they might have come to the same conclusion and said, it doesn't really have anything we care about. It's hosted by somebody else. It's not on our network, which was the case. And so thus, we're not going to spend much time implementing any technical controls to secure that system because we don't care about it. But what they failed to realize is that the data on that could actually lead us to that important application and thus lead us to everything that this organization has. And so again, it's important to understand that properly identifying your threats, their motives, and most importantly, their methods, what they're actually going to do if they exploit certain vulnerabilities, can help you much more appropriately secure your organization. So I want to cover two other things that led us to make the recommendations that we're making as part of this presentation. One is, so we talked about credential reuse there, but another is a different form and frankly a more insidious form of credential reuse, which allows us to perform a technique called pass the hash. So in Windows systems, if different machines, so multiple workstations, share the same credentials, right? So administrator, the username is administrator and the password is, super secret secure password 123. We don't even need to crack that password to use those credentials to authenticate to other machines. So what that means is if I compromise one workstation on your network, I can very easily identify other machines that I can authenticate to without having to crack the password on that system. and thus compromise those systems very, very easily. And so we, generally speaking, still see organizations that mostly use the same password to authenticate locally on all their workstations, and generally it seems like they also set a unique set of credentials for their servers, but it's still the same issue. That means if I compromise one server, I can authenticate to all of your servers and very, very easily compromise them. And so again, we'll come back to this technique, which is called pass the hash later, and talk about some of the controls you can implement to secure yourself against that. So without further ado, let's get into the technical controls and talk a little bit more about them and what we recommend for them. Let me just take a sip of water here. So before we dive into the technical details, I want to give you one more perspective on our philosophy, which is one very, very critical thing that I feel like a lot of organizations don't embrace, and that is this concept of context. So a lot of places will make recommendations without actually applying the specific context of that organization, right? Everyone on this phone call is in a much better spot than I am, understanding the specific nuances of your network, of your politics, of your budget, of your environment, to implement these controls in a way that makes the most sense based on that context. And so again, even situations, the example I like to use is that, everyone just assumes Telnet is bad and that you can't ever use it. And for the most part, I agree with that. Telnet is an insecure protocol and you shouldn't use it. But that being said, there are situations where it's completely fine to use Telnet. And so, I'm gonna leave that dangling out there. And if anyone wants to go over specific context in which that's okay, we can dive down that rabbit hole later. But what I want you to take away from this is, apply the controls and the recommendations we're making here to the context of your environment. Some of it will make perfect sense, and you can just use it as we're stating it here. And other times you're going to have to say, well, here's why this might be too much effort or too costly for us to implement in our environment, but here's some of the nuggets we can take away and implement in our environment. And so as part of this context conversation, another thing that I want you to walk away with is the perspective. And this kind of falls in line with the concept of defense in depth, which is if you implement some of these controls and that is your only control. So for example, let's say that you implement network monitoring, but you only implement it in one location, you have a very, very limited perspective on the data that you're obtaining. And so the more locations where you can implement some of these controls and have supporting perspectives and not just rely on one technical control, you're going to be in a far better spot. All right, so let's get to the boring text-based slides and the actual recommendations. And so what I'm going to say is I have a PDF that we're going to share. We'll blast out to everybody on the invite with all of these recommendations, as well as some of the specific technical controls that we're recommending, so that you shouldn't have to worry about taking notes here. So the first is a relatively easy one to understand, and that is to not reuse credentials. And the key here being to just not use credentials across disparate systems, right? So the very detrimental ones are when you saw in the story earlier, we were able to compromise a junk application, and the same passwords there on that very insecure system were used for an otherwise very secure system. And so, what we see commonly as well are things like users reusing passwords that have been exposed in public data breaches. And so think about that for a minute, right? If Yahoo is breached for the 20th time and your users use the same password for their Yahoo email as they do to VPN into your office, right? Now, something that is completely out of your control, right, the security of Yahoo, has really impacted your organization in a very meaningful way. And so educating everyone on the importance of not reusing passwords is very, very important. And so again, we talked about the Windows environments and the pass the hash technique. And so it's very important for technical administrators to understand that you should not be setting the same credentials on all of your workstations nor on any of your servers. So do not implement the same credentials on those systems. And so to do that, there's two really good products called Microsoft Labs, which is obviously provided by Microsoft, and then there's an open source option from TrustedSec called ships. So I provide links to both of those in the PDF that we'll share after this after the WebEx. And so again, one of the things that I want to highlight here is that this is not some crazy technique that is beyond the realm of even non-technical users. So again, if I was able to identify even just a password on a Post-it note, it's relatively easy to just Google organization and identify the different systems that they might be able to log into and try and see if I can log into those systems. So this is a very, very easy technique. It doesn't require a whole lot of skill. Pass the hash, although it is a relatively technical attack, it's still extremely easy to implement. The tools to do it are freely available, and they're basically to the point where they are point and shoot. It requires relatively little skill to actually execute those attacks, and it is absolutely a favorite of hackers of every skill level. And most meaningful, and this is a relatively new thing, is that malware has started to use this pass the hash technique. There's actually been ransomware that's used this pass the hash technique. So again, think about that for a second. If one of your end users was infected with ransomware, if you were using the same credentials across even just a handful of your workstations, that means that ransomware could quickly and very, very easily spread to those other workstations, right, without any interaction from humans. And so that's why we really wanted to highlight this control, because if those things are not in place, it makes it a lot more difficult if someone were to compromise one of your workstations, or if malware were to compromise a workstation, for it to spread to other machines using these very, very common techniques. All right, so next up is to properly segment your network. And so again, this is one of those controls that has been around for a very, very long time. We just don't see enough organizations really embracing what it means. And so ultimately, the starting point for this, from our perspective, is to just come up with a very, very simple strategy, right? Document what you're trying to accomplish, and then define basic security zones to implement that. So some examples here is, should your end user, typical workstations, people in human resources and accounting, your customer service people, is there any business reason why those machines should be able to initiate connections to your technical admins? I think 99 times out of probably 99, you don't need to do that. And so why would we allow that from a network perspective? Things like printers, right? Some organizations we've seen lately are getting better at putting those on their own VLAN, but then they fail to actually secure them by limiting what users can actually do. And if you limit that to things like only the ports necessary to actually print versus things like the web interfaces on these systems, which are generally speaking very vulnerable, things like FTP and SNMP, those are just unnecessary. And so if users don't need to interact with those machines and those ports, then just block them. And here's a very, very easy one. Again, if you just take your workstations and say, under what circumstance should my end user workstations be able to RDP to the domain controllers, there's never a business reason for that. And so we should block that. And so once you have these security zones defined, it's just a matter of actually implementing those ACLs and testing them to make sure that they're accomplishing what you want. But at the end of the day, this obviously requires no capital cost, right? Layer 3 switches have had this functionality for decades. And so this doesn't necessarily require you to go out and purchase all new firewalls or even necessarily implement new firewalls, right? These can be implemented, generally speaking, very easily on Layer 3 switches. And so again, if you look at the example we used earlier, right? So the Intel app, we could not communicate with that app directly from our testing machines, but it could communicate with us. And again, it seems like there can't possibly be a business justification for that. So they believe that this app was only accessible from that important app, which generally speaking it was, but then they failed to actually filter what this could do outbound to the internet. So if they had just blocked that, again, our attack might have been completely denied, if not made extremely difficult. And again, that internal application, right, there isn't necessarily a reason why it should be able to communicate with the entire broader internal network. So if you don't need that from a business reason, then you should implement that and block it. So what I want to do is wrap this up, the network segmentation recommendation, with two very practical, tactical things you can start with. So to start the conversation internally, determine what do your typical workstations that communicate with the internet look like, and what should those be able to actually communicate with. And so if you start there and treat your workstations as if it's a DMZ, because that's ultimately what it is, right? That's where a lot of that ingress and egress traffic, and where, frankly, a lot of the initial beachhead compromises occur in organizations are on these workstations. If you treat those as very hostile machines and say, okay, what should these be able to communicate with, because we can assume that at some point at least one of these workstations is going to be compromised, you'll be in a much better spot. And so obviously apply that as well to your actual DMZ servers, and don't just limit inbound traffic, but limit anything that those DMZ servers can communicate with, and just assume that at some point, don't worry about the actual technical vulnerability, just assume that both workstations and DMZ servers will experience some type of compromise where someone would essentially have complete control over those machines. If you approach it from that perspective, you'll be in a much better spot. And so the nice thing about this approach, because I think that's becoming a common a phrase, is that you should assume you're going to experience a breach, and I agree with that. But don't try to boil the ocean and say, okay, well everything could be breached. It's like start with your highest risk assets, which in most organizations' cases is workstations and DMZ servers. If you start with those, you will be far ahead of the curve. And so also, one of the nice things about implementing a very good network segmentation strategy is that it makes monitoring that much easier. If you know those high-risk VLANs, it's much easier to just start by monitoring those. And so there is no longer an excuse to not have some type of at least basic network security monitoring in place. One of my favorite IDS platforms is Security Onion. It's a Linux live distribution where you can basically get, probably 50 different network security monitoring tools up in less than a day. It's very, very easy, and if you only do one thing with it, I highly recommend that you play with the IDS functionality using either Snort or Suricata, and using the emerging threats rule set. So the emerging threats is a very, very good, very active set of IDS rules. There's a free version and a pro version, and frankly, the pro version itself is relatively cost-effective. The specific number is escaping me, but I believe it's under $1,000, maybe somewhere around $1,200 the last time I checked. Please don't quote me on that. But there is a free version, and frankly, the only difference is just, I think, how quickly certain signatures get pushed. Otherwise, it's a very, very great baseline, because if you don't even have a basic understanding of what's happening in these high-risk network segments, then you're really missing out. And even things like we still see organizations that can't even tell us how much bandwidth these different segments are using. So they can't tell me what's normal, and they can't determine, okay, is an attacker exfiltrating gigabytes of data from a user workstation out to a Russian IP address. You should be able to identify those things, and those tools have been around for a very, very long time. And again, those are actually even built into Security Onion itself. As part of monitoring, we have never, during our engagements, we've never been stopped because of antivirus, and we commonly set off antivirus alerts. Right, so some of our tools will get picked up, some of the specific techniques we're trying to use. Even lately, certain PowerShell scripts have been picked up by antivirus, but we've never been stopped by an admin who actually says, "Oh, okay, I noticed this antivirus alert. I responded to it. I noticed there were some indications of compromise on this machine. I took care of it, and it prevented us from doing something nasty." And so I'm really looking forward to the day when that happens, and I can, drive out to that client. I don't care where they are in America. We'll drive out to them, give them a huge hug, and say, "Congratulations, you're the first ones to stop us," even though we've been setting off antivirus alarms for years. So number 4 is a very, very simple one, and again, it kind of goes into everything we've been talking about, which is ultimately least privilege or minimum necessary. And so the number of times where we still see that user workstations are mostly allowed to hit everything on the internet, and if they're not, sometimes we still see that they are forced to go through a proxy, but that's great for the things that will actually go through a proxy. So things like web traffic and some updates might go through a proxy, but things like SMB or CIFS can still go out directly to the internet, and that's a big no-no. There should be no reason why the vast majority of your workstations need to communicate directly with potentially malicious sites. And so that's why we recommend that you limit what users can access and monitor that. We love proxy technologies. We think they're a huge step in the right direction. But once you have a proxy server implemented, make sure that you're also actually just limiting what those users can directly communicate with over the internet. And just think about it. If there's traffic on that workstation that can't go through a proxy, what is it and should it be allowed, right? A lot of times even things like, sending files and things like that can be secured in a meaningful way. And again, one of the examples I used is we still see this commonly where an organization might use proxy servers, but they still allow outbound SMB and CIFS. And if you're not familiar with those are the file sharing protocols, which have been built into Windows since Windows 98. And so last but certainly not least, we recommend that organizations start to secure PowerShell, and the best way to do this is to not use it. And so the reason why we're making this recommendation is because a ton of common tools are released as PowerShell scripts and used by hackers. And to make matters worse, again, this ups the likelihood that you're to experience this, is that PowerShell is now becoming a favorite component of malware. So some of the ransomware we've seen gets kicked off or downloaded or run using PowerShell. And so, sure, it's not a silver bullet to remove PowerShell. Clearly, that's not going to stop all malware. But because this is becoming more common, if you don't need it, you should rip it out. So again, that's why our recommendation is to uninstall it if you can. And if you can uninstall it, you should try to remove it. And if you can't remove it, you should try to rip it out. And if all of those fail and you can't do any of that, then you should harden it, which is far, far beyond the scope of what we can talk about here. Frankly, we could probably talk about that for an entire day because it's a very, very tricky process, which again is why I recommend that you just uninstall it on machines if you don't use it. And the link to the Microsoft blog article on hardening it is included in the PDF, which we're going to share. So again, if you want to do some more reading on that, you'll have that opportunity. So that's it. That's all I have. So now I'm going to open up to questions. Let me see if anyone has any questions here. All right, so I don't see a single question in the chat box. I'm not sure if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but I'll give you folks 2 minutes if there's anything you want to ask, and I'll unmute unmute you, Shakol.
Oh, thank you. I don't have any questions, but that's because I've seen your presentations before.
Yeah. All right, sounds good.
I have gotten much good feedback on your use of the slides, though, so good job with all of the memes.
All right, good. Oh, yeah, I think I'm not seeing any questions come in the chat. So with that, I'll say thanks so much for joining us. Again, I'll get this information over to Shakol. We did record the session, so as well, if you feel that urge to watch it again, you'll have that opportunity.
Thank you so much, Tyler, and thank you everyone for joining. Hopefully we will see you at the last webinar on the 24th. Have a great rest of your lunch break.
All right, thanks, Shakol. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.